Millionaire thought he was marrying an ugly woman in arranged marriage, but he was shocked when he married a girl without seeing her face. Everyone around him discussed her veil, whispered behind her back, and laughed. But when the truth came out, the whole room froze. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The skies over the Hastingbury estate hung heavy with clouds, the low rumble of thunder, distant drumbeat echoing across the hills. A fine mist clung to the air as the mourners gathered around the polished mahogany casket resting at the heart of the family cemetery. The headstone was already carved. Victor H. Hastings, 1952-2023, visionary, leader, father. Words, etched in stone, felt hollow to Edward Hastings as he stood, still as a statue, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his black overcoat. He had not cried. Not when the call came. Not at the hospital. Not now. He had spent most of his 30 years preparing for this moment, though not in mourning. No, Victor Hastings had trained his only son for inheritance, like one would train a thoroughbred for the Derby. With precision, with pressure, without affection. Everything about Victor had been calculated, efficient, relentless. And now, with him gone, everything had passed to Edward. The empire, the properties, the power, and the obligations. The funeral concluded in murmured prayers and restrained sobs from board members and distant cousins alike. Edward remained behind while the others drifted away, watching the cemetery crew lower the coffin into the earth as if it were just another task in a day of obligations. His mother, Eleanor, approached silently and slipped her hand through his arm. She looked small beside him, her posture graceful but fatigued. "He would have wanted you to stand tall," she said softly. Edward didn't respond. He didn't feel tall. He felt like a puppet, wound tight with invisible strings. That evening, as the family gathered in the library of the main house, Edward sat at the head of the long walnut table beneath the heavy chandelier. The fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting flickers of light across the room lined with portraits of stoic ancestors. The solicitor, Mr. Grant, an aging man with round spectacles and a clipped English accent, cleared his throat and opened a thick leather-bound portfolio. The late Mr. Hastings left a number of directives concerning the continuity of the family's holdings, Grant began, most of which are straightforward. However, there is a particular clause that requires immediate attention. Edward, nursing a glass of scotch, raised a brow. "Let me guess, something controlling, dramatic, and absolutely inconvenient." His mother gave him a quiet look but said nothing. Mr. Grant adjusted his spectacles. In order to maintain a binding strategic partnership with the Valanda family, a multi-generational conglomerate with holdings in telecommunications, mining, and energy, particularly in East and Central Africa, your father committed to an alliance in the form of marriage, specifically between yourself and the Valanda's designated heir, a woman named Milana. The room fell silent. Edward laughed once. "You're joking." "I'm afraid not," Mr. Grant said without flinching. "This was part of a confidential memorandum of understanding signed 5 years ago and updated as recently as last autumn. The terms specify that the marriage must take place within 30 days of Mr. Hastings' death, or the agreement becomes void, and the Valand Group will withdraw from all existing joint ventures." "That's blackmail," Edward said, standing now. "He's using marriage like a chess piece. I'm not a token to be traded in a business merger." "This isn't only about you," Eleanor said, her voice sharper now. "This is about preserving an empire your grandfather built from nothing, about safeguarding the jobs of thousands of employees. You think this is beneath you, but your father saw the long game. He always did. And what about love? What about freedom? Edward demanded. His mother sighed. Your father didn't believe in fairy tales. Edward turned away from them both, running a hand through his thick blonde hair. The fire snapped behind him. I don't even know this woman. I've never met her. For all I know, she's a stranger who— You will meet her, Mr. Grant interrupted, glancing at his watch. Tomorrow, in fact, she and a representative of the Valenda family will arrive at noon. Edward stared at him. He really arranged all of this? Even in death, he's still dictating my life. He arranged a future, Eleanor said coolly. What you make of it is up to you. The next morning passed in a haze. Edward awoke in the east wing of the estate, the vast bedroom with its velvet drapes and dark-paneled walls offering little comfort. He dressed reluctantly in a tailored suit, knowing full well the pageantry he was expected to uphold. Downstairs, the staff had already begun preparing the reception parlor: flowers, fresh linens, imported teas. At noon sharp, a black Rolls-Royce pulled up the circular driveway. Edward watched from the window, arms crossed, as a tall, broad-shouldered man in traditional Angolan attire stepped out first. He was followed by a woman in a dark green dress, long-sleeved and high-necked, her face entirely veiled in black chiffon. Her posture was regal, her steps soundless. The air around her felt still. Edward met them in the drawing room with the barest pretense of civility. The man introduced himself as Ambassador Patrice Valland, Milana's uncle. His accent was warm, refined, his demeanor diplomatic. He spoke of heritage, legacy, unity. Edward barely listened. Milana sat beside her uncle, hands folded on her lap, speaking only when addressed. Her voice was calm, nearly expressionless, yet her diction was precise. She never once reached to lift her veil. After the initial pleasantries, Ambassador Valland handed Edward a velvet box containing a ceremonial engagement pendant carved from rare ebony and inset with gold. A symbol of our union, he said. Edward accepted it stiffly. The meeting ended, as such affairs do, with polite nods and vague assurances. Milana never removed her veil. She didn't even flinch when Edward, half in frustration, asked her why she wore it. It is my choice, she answered. That night, Edward stormed into his father's old study and poured himself another drink. The oak shelves loomed around him like sentinels. He stared at a portrait of Victor Hastings behind the desk. You really thought you could control me from beyond the grave, he muttered. Well, congratulations, it worked. The days that followed passed quickly. With arrangements formalized and legal documentation underway, the wedding date was set for 10 days from the initial meeting. Eleanor insisted on a private, tasteful ceremony on the grounds. No media, no spectacle. Edward attended the fittings and rehearsals like a mannequin. Silent, stiff, and cold. Milana remained invisible. She did not stay at the estate, but in a discreet residence nearby. No interviews, no photographs, no unveiled appearances. Rumors began to spread among Edward's acquaintances. Some called her a mystery. Others, more cruel, called her a scandal waiting to happen. On the eve of the wedding, Edward found himself standing on the terrace alone, staring at the vast lawn where rows of white chairs had been arranged. Lanterns swayed in the wind. His fingers gripped the railing. He thought about running, about leaving it all behind. But even he knew that his sense of duty, however fractured, was stronger than his ego. And so, the next day, under a sky cleared of clouds and watched by only a few close family members, Edward Hastings married a woman he had never truly met. She wore white. She wore the veil. She said her vows in a voice calm and unwavering, and Edward, jaw set, kissed the chiffon fabric covering her cheek. There was no thunderous applause, no music swelled, no teary embrace, only silence, and the quiet realization that whatever this marriage would become, it had only just begun. The applause had barely died down before Edward Hastings turned away from the last guest with a muted nod and a tight-lipped smile. The ceremony, such as it was, had concluded not 30 minutes ago, and yet he already felt as though hours had passed. The white chairs scattered across the lawn looked abandoned, forgotten by the small crowd that had gathered in formal wear to witness the union of two powerful families. The sun dipped low, casting long, golden beams across the sprawling estate as the new couple posed briefly for a single photograph. He standing tall, she beside him, cloaked in ivory silk and black chiffon, her face entirely hidden from view. When the photographer requested a second picture with them facing each other, Edward hesitated. He looked at Milana, whose veil flowed gently in the breeze like a thin, living thing. Her posture was graceful, unmoved, the same collected stillness that had followed her since the moment they met. He turned to the camera instead, jaw clenched and the shutter clicked. By evening, the reception had shifted indoors to the grand ballroom, its high ceiling glittering with chandeliers and soft candlelight. A string quartet played near the marble fireplace, their music delicate, unobtrusive. The long tables, adorned with white roses and gold-trimmed crystal, were filled with carefully selected guests, distant relatives, shareholders, high society allies. All of them spoke in polite, clipped tones, their curiosity thinly veiled beneath smiles. Edward sat at the head table beside his new wife, separated by a gulf of silence rather than space. Milana sat perfectly poised, her hands folded on her lap, a plate of untouched delicacies before her. She hadn't removed the veil, not even to sip champagne. A few brave or foolish guests dared to whisper theories between forkfuls of caviar. "Maybe she's a recluse," one woman murmured, her voice dripping with condescension. "I heard she was disfigured in an accident years ago," said another. "Or perhaps she's hiding something worse." Edward heard every word. His ears were trained now like a soldier's on the battlefield. He clenched the stem of his glass harder, biting back a retort. What was he to say? That he knew no more than they did? That the mystery infuriated him, too? When he finally looked toward Milana, she was calmly buttering a roll, her movements unbothered. Not a single muscle in her body betrayed discomfort. It was as though the whispers meant nothing. Or worse, she had anticipated them. Later, when the music swelled and couples began to dance, Edward made no move to join the floor. He remained at the table, drink in hand, watching as Milana exchanged polite nods with an older woman across the room. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to him all evening. Even the ride from the ceremony to the ballroom had passed in silence, their shared limousine filled only with the soft sound of tires on gravel and the awkward space between strangers bound by law. As the clock neared midnight, a butler approached discreetly and informed them that their private suite was ready. Edward rose from his chair mechanically, offering Milana his arm as protocol demanded. She accepted it lightly, without hesitation, and they exited the ballroom to a brief rustle of silk and murmurs following them like a shadow. The suite was located in the northern wing of the estate, far removed from the guest rooms. It was lavish, with tall windows, antique furniture, and a four-poster bed draped in ivory gauze. A small fireplace crackled in the corner, and a tray of chocolates and champagne sat atop a polished table. Edward entered first and immediately tossed off his jacket onto a nearby chair. Milana followed him in silence, her footsteps soft against the carpet. He turned to face her, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders like an anchor. "Are you going to keep that on forever?" he asked, nodding toward the veil. She began removing her gloves one finger at a time, unhurried. "Until I'm ready," she replied. He laughed bitterly, the sound dry and hollow in the quiet room. "Ready for what? To reveal whatever it is you're hiding? Or are you just enjoying this little game?" Milana set the gloves neatly on the vanity, then turned to face him, her eyes visible through the sheer black fabric. "This isn't a game, Edward, and I'm not hiding anything that should matter." "Not to you, maybe," he shot back, "but I'm the one they're whispering about. I'm the one standing next to a bride no one's allowed to see. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" She tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but with the air of someone who had already weighed and measured this argument. "If their opinions matter more to you than I do, then perhaps you should reconsider what this marriage is about." The words landed with more force than he expected. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. She turned away and began undoing the clasp of her necklace. The room fell into silence once more, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the clink of metal on marble. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, downed it in one go, and walked to the far end of the suite. "Fine," he muttered. "Keep your secrets, but don't expect me to wait forever." She said nothing. Instead, she seated herself at the vanity, removed her earrings with quiet care, and began brushing her hair beneath the veil. Edward watched her for a moment longer, something tight and unfamiliar twisting in his chest. Anger, yes, but also confusion. And, if he were honest, curiosity. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the suite. Two strangers in a palace of luxury. Two names on a certificate. The space between them echoed louder than any vow. The days that followed did little to soften the frost between them. Edward buried himself in his work, retreating to his office at dawn and returning long after dark. Meetings, mergers, memos, he welcomed the distraction. At home, he kept to himself, speaking to Milana only when necessary, and never beyond what civility required. She did not press him. She neither sought him out nor imposed her presence upon him. Yet, despite their silence, he began to notice things. The household staff, once clumsy and slow, moved with newfound precision. The kitchens ran smoother, the garden was better tended, and even the library, long neglected, now gleamed as though dust had never touched its shelves. Edward observed these changes like one might observe shifting weather patterns, quietly, without acknowledgement, but not without awareness. He passed Milana once in the hallway as she was speaking to Mrs. Talbot, the housekeeper. Her tone was soft but assertive. She held a small list in her hand, and Mrs. Talbot was nodding, attentive. When she noticed Edward, Milana inclined her head in a polite acknowledgement. He nodded back stiffly and kept walking. One afternoon, while reviewing a particularly thorny merger proposal in the sunlit study, Edward found himself stuck on a clause that refused to make sense. He cursed under his breath and pushed the papers aside. "May I?" came a voice behind him. He turned, surprised. Milana stood in the doorway holding a closed book in her hands. She wore a simple dress, her veil thinner than usual, allowing more of her outline to be seen. He blinked. "This isn't exactly your area of expertise," he said, not unkindly, but not invitingly either. She stepped forward anyway. "Perhaps not, but I've read the proposal. The issue isn't the numbers, it's the ambiguity in this paragraph." She reached down and pointed to a section with gloved fingers. This phrase, subject to discretion, leaves too much room for interpretation. That's why the other party is hesitant. Edward leaned in despite himself. She was right. "How do you even know that?" he asked. "I read," she said simply. He stared at her, searching her eyes through the fabric, but she was already stepping back, book in hand. "Tighten the phrasing. Be specific. You'll have your deal." Then she left, and Edward was left staring after her, something unsettled brewing in his chest. That evening, as he sat alone in his office, he found himself remembering her words, her tone, her presence. Not loud, not demanding, but deliberate, measured, precise. The veil no longer seemed like a wall, it felt like a puzzle, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to solve it or feared what he might find beneath. The days after that brief encounter in the study passed with a strange and disconcerting stillness. Edward found himself increasingly aware of Milana's presence, or rather her quiet influence. It was not just the study or the merger, though he had followed her suggestion and the deal had moved forward smoothly since. No, it was something more insidious, more pervasive, and infinitely harder to name. It was in the silence of the halls, no longer echoing with disorganization, in the rhythmic hum of a household that was functioning more efficiently than it ever had, and in the way the staff seemed to carry themselves with a faint but unmistakable air of assurance, as if they were no longer serving a cold dynasty but a living order. Yet, for all the subtlety of her presence, she remained in many ways a phantom. Edward would hear her soft voice in passing, offering clear instructions to the kitchen staff, engaging with the gardener on planting schedules, asking the butler about the timing of supply deliveries. She never raised her voice, never demanded attention, and never positioned herself as the lady of the house. She simply moved through it, adjusting small things, correcting inefficiencies, healing fractures too long ignored. And she did all this beneath her ever-present veil. Edward kept to his routines, partly out of habit, partly out of an unspoken resistance to the effect she was beginning to have on him. He would rise early and retreat to his office, spend his hours on calls and contracts, and take his dinners in the West Parlor, or, on occasion, out in the city under the guise of business. But more and more often, he found himself thinking of the brief moment in the study, of her voice, her clarity, her absolute composure. He would catch himself staring at his notes during meetings, wondering what she might have said about a particular clause or angle. The realization irritated him. She was supposed to be an inconvenience, an obligation. Instead, she was becoming a presence in his thoughts. One evening, as he returned from a late meeting downtown, he passed through the corridor near the library and heard the faint sound of piano music. Soft, hesitant at first, then growing bolder. Curious, he paused by the door, which was ajar. Inside, he saw her, Milana, seated at the grand piano, her fingers gliding across the keys with a fluid grace that betrayed years of practice. She wore a simple gray dress, and her veil was a lighter fabric than usual, almost translucent in the warm lamplight. Her posture was straight, elegant. She was alone, and for a moment, her face tilted toward the music. Edward caught a glimpse of something more than restraint. There was longing there, or perhaps sorrow. He didn't enter. He stood there quietly until the music faded, and then walked away, and his heart oddly unsteady. Days later, as the weekend approached, Eleanor invited them both to a charity brunch hosted by the Hastings Foundation. It was meant to be a small affair, but still high-profile enough to warrant appearances. Edward reluctantly agreed. When he informed Milana over breakfast, an awkward, mostly silent affair at the breakfast nook in the conservatory, She nodded without question. "We're expected at noon," he said. "You don't have to speak. Just show up." She didn't answer immediately, then simply said, "I'll be ready." He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. Resistance, maybe. Some sign of displeasure. Instead, her composure was absolute. He stood, unsure whether to say something more, then left with a faint scowl at himself for wanting to prolong the exchange. At the brunch, Milana arrived a few minutes after him, dressed in a flowing dark teal ensemble with long sleeves and a high neckline. The veil was of matching fabric, embroidered subtly at the edges. She moved beside him without effort, like a shadow that cast no weight. The guests, predictably, fell into hushed clusters around the terrace and garden path, their conversations laced with curiosity and calculation. Edward kept close to the bar, sipping his drink and offering only the necessary greetings. Milana exchanged polite nods, but spoke little. He caught snippets of conversation nearby. "Still hiding, I see," murmured one woman behind a bejeweled clutch. "Perhaps she doesn't speak English," someone else whispered. "Or perhaps she doesn't want to." Edward's fingers curled around his glass. When he turned, ready to snap, Milana lightly touched his arm. The gesture was fleeting, but enough to stop him. "They will speak regardless," she said quietly. He looked at her, really looked, trying to read her expression through the veil. But there was nothing but calm, an unyielding stillness he was beginning to realize had been earned through experience, not indifference. That night, he asked her, over another shared dinner of silent courses and clinking silverware, "Doesn't it bother you, what they say?" Milana looked up. "What they say isn't new." Her answer lingered in his mind long after they had parted for the night. The more he saw of her, the more Edward realized that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was strength. The way she carried herself, the way she never apologized for existing in the space she'd been given, the way she listened before speaking. These weren't traits of someone hiding, but of someone who had been misjudged before and learned that patience was the best armor. One morning, while reviewing updates on the Valanda partnership in the dining room, Edward found himself muttering over a series of proposals and cultural outreach initiatives. He didn't notice Milana enter until she spoke. "There's a line in there that's poorly phrased," she said, gesturing to the screen. He frowned. "You've read this?" "I asked for a copy." He blinked. "Why?" "Because it's my family's legacy too." Her tone wasn't confrontational, just matter-of-fact. He paused, then looked back at the document. She was right. Again. That afternoon, he gave his assistant instructions to start including Milana in the distribution of certain reports. He wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because he couldn't deny her insight. Perhaps because part of him was growing tired of pretending she didn't matter. Perhaps, if he were honest, because he wanted to see what she would do with real power. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud. They shared space now, not warmth, not yet, but presence. They had dinner together more often than not, sometimes discussing the news, sometimes sitting in silence. Edward began asking for her opinion during late-night review sessions. She began offering them without waiting to be invited. He noticed things, the way she arranged flowers in a vase by the window, the way she left tea for him on his desk when he returned from meetings, the way her veil fluttered slightly when she laughed at one of the butler's dry jokes. The distance between them was shrinking, not fast, not dramatically, but steadily. And yet, for all this, the veil remained. Always the veil. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back negotiations, Edward returned to find Milana speaking to Mrs. Talbot in the foyer. The older woman smiled as she handed Milana a small bundle of fresh herbs from the kitchen garden. "I didn't know you were interested in cooking," he said, unthinking. Milana turned, bundle in hand. "Only in feeding people properly." He smirked. "And here I thought you were here to torment me with your secrets." For a moment, just a moment, he thought she might smile beneath the fabric. Her eyes softened. "I don't torment you, Edward. You torment yourself." Later that night, he stood outside her sitting room door for nearly a full minute before deciding not to knock. He returned to his own side of the suite and lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how it was possible to feel so close to someone he still didn't really know, and wondering more than ever if the mystery was something she wore to protect herself, or something she offered him, piece by piece, to see if he was worthy of the truth underneath. By the time October settled over the Hastingbury estate, the trees lining the drive had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson. The wind carried a crispness that whispered of approaching winter, and the days grew shorter, pushing dusk into mid-afternoon. Inside the house, routines had settled into something resembling comfort, or perhaps a truce. Edward no longer avoided Milana, nor did he retreat from her presence. They dined together most evenings, discussed company matters with a rhythm that verged on ease, and moved through the same spaces with a quiet familiarity that had not existed weeks before. But the veil remained. The morning of the crisis began like any other. Edward sat at his desk reviewing the latest update on the Delcor merger, an international acquisition that had been a linchpin in the Hastings Group's future expansion. He had spent months nurturing the deal, aligning board support, smoothing over cultural nuances with the Delcor executives. It was delicate work, but necessary. And now, with the final round of approval on the line, it threatened to unravel. "Sir," his assistant, Margot, said as she entered the room, holding a thin stack of papers. "There's been a development. You need to see this." Edward took the papers and scanned them, his brow furrowing. Delcor's legal team had flagged a series of clauses they now deemed problematic. Vague language, cultural oversteps, insufficient clarity on profit-sharing models. In short, everything they had previously accepted without concern had now been thrown into question. "They're threatening to pull out?" Edward asked, voice low but tight. "They've halted further meetings, for now," Margot said. He stood, tossing the papers onto the desk. "Damn it, we're 2 weeks from signing." Margot hesitated. Their lead counsel requested a review in a more neutral setting, whatever that means. He paced the length of the study, frustration burning through his chest. Months of effort, relationships, strategy, all for nothing because someone on their side had gotten too clever with language, or because Delcor was looking for an excuse, or both. Later that evening, as he sat in the dining room absently pushing food across his plate, Milana observed him with calm attentiveness. He hadn't said much since she entered. The fire behind them glowed softly, casting shadows along the carved mantelpiece. The crystal glasses on the table remained full. "You're troubled," she said simply. Edward looked up, tired. "I'm losing the Delcor deal. It's collapsing under our feet." She said nothing, waiting. He sighed and leaned back. "They think we're arrogant, that we wrote this thing with too much legal muscle and too little cultural respect. I tried to work around it, but they've gone silent." Milana reached for her water. "Then invite them here." He blinked. "Here? To the estate?" She nodded. "Yes, not to a boardroom, not to a hotel, to your home. Let them see who you are beyond the language in a contract." "They don't care about who I am," he replied. "They care about what they're signing." "Then show them both," she said, her voice even. "Let them sit at your table. Let them feel the weight of your commitment, not just to profit, but to partnership." Edward looked at her, not quite scoffing, but close. "You think a dinner party is going to fix this?" "I think a carefully constructed atmosphere can do what sterile documents cannot." He stared at her across the table, seeing not just a veiled stranger now, but a strategist, one with patience, vision, and a different kind of intelligence than he was used to trusting. After a long pause, he exhaled. "Fine. You think it'll work, then help me plan it." "I already have," she replied. And she had. In the days that followed, Milana took to the task with efficiency that stunned him. She reviewed the profiles of every Delcor executive attending, prepared notes on cultural etiquette, dietary preferences, and historical family ties. She coordinated with the chef to design a menu that balanced French and African cuisine, Delcor's roots and the Valand family's traditions. She worked with the household staff to prepare rooms in the East Wing for overnight guests and even personally supervised the placement of the long dining table in the greenhouse atrium, where the autumn leaves would serve as natural decoration under strings of warm lanterns. Edward watched it all unfold with a strange mixture of admiration and discomfort. She moved like someone born to command a space, not through authority, but through quiet certainty. Her veil never left her face, but somehow she saw everything. He began to defer to her more than he expected, sometimes without realizing it. When the evening of the dinner arrived, the estate was aglow with gentle light. The greenhouse had been transformed into a haven of understated elegance: linen tablecloths, golden cutlery, low arrangements of crimson dahlias and autumn berries. The air carried the scent of cedarwood and saffron. The Delcor delegation arrived just after sunset, their cars pulling into the drive with practiced pomp. Edward greeted them personally. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like composure returning to him. He walked beside Milana into the atrium, his hand lightly guiding her, and introduced her not by title, but simply as his wife and partner. No one questioned the veil. Perhaps it was her poise. Perhaps it was the way she stood without apology, as though she had already earned the respect they didn't yet know how to offer. The dinner began with quiet conversation and cautious toasts. The wine flowed. So did the stories. Milana engaged delicately, asking the Delcor executives thoughtful questions about their work, their homes, their histories. She remembered details, connected dots between one anecdote and the next. Her presence was not commanding in volume, but in gravity. The guest leaned in when she spoke, smiled when she laughed. By the time dessert was served, a delicate dish of spiced citrus creme over rosewater sponge, Edward could see the tension melting from the shoulders around the table. It was working. After the guests retired to the lounge for a final round of drinks, Edward pulled Milana aside into the hallway near the conservatory entrance. "You're good at this," he said quietly. She regarded him through the veil. "I know." He smiled in spite of himself. "I didn't expect this to work. I didn't expect you to make it work." "I didn't do it for you," she said softly. "I did it because it needed to be done." He nodded, the smile fading. "Still, thank you." She hesitated, then touched his wrist gently. "You're welcome." The next morning, the Delcor executives held an informal meeting over breakfast and confirmed their intention to move forward with the merger. Edward received the news with relief, but also with a profound sense of something else, a recognition that without Milana, it would have failed. At the board meeting that followed, several directors commended his diplomacy. He accepted their praise with practiced professionalism, but inside, he knew who had salvaged the deal. That evening, he returned home and found Milana in the library, seated by the tall windows, reading. He stood silently for a moment before speaking. "I owe you more than thanks." She looked up. "You owe me nothing." "That's not true," he said. "You saved something I couldn't." She closed the book carefully. "It was ours to save." He walked toward her, then paused. "Why did you do it, Milana? Why involve yourself so deeply in a deal that means nothing to you personally?" She considered the question. "Because it's not just a deal. It's a foundation, and foundations are only as strong as the people willing to uphold them." He sank into the chair across from her, tired but no longer burdened. "Then maybe I've misjudged you." "Maybe," she said. For the first time in weeks, he found himself leaning forward, not just in posture, but in intent. Would you stay a while? Talk with me?" She didn't move at first, then she nodded. They talked long into the evening, the fire in the hearth slowly burning to embers. They spoke not only of business, but of memory, her childhood summers in Luanda, his schooling in Switzerland, the loneliness of inheritance, and the ache of always being watched. When they finally parted, he found himself lingering at the door of her room longer than necessary. The next morning, he woke with a strange sense of anticipation. The veil was still there, but so was something new. Trust, perhaps, or the first breath of something that might one day become it. Autumn settled fully over the estate, cloaking the grounds in a veil of fading gold and gray. The gardens, once bursting with late summer vibrance, had softened into muted tones. Leaves carpeted the walkways, and the fountains, though still running, now reflected a cooler sky. Inside the house, warmth radiated not just from the fireplaces, but from something else. Something less tangible, yet unmistakably present. Since the evening of the Delcourt dinner, Edward had begun to see Milana in a light he had not thought possible. Her presence was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a steady force he had come to rely on. Their interactions were no longer laced with tension, but marked by mutual awareness and, more surprising than anything, comfort. He now sought her opinion with sincerity, listened without skepticism, and in moments of silence felt no need to fill the void with noise. The veil remained, yes, but its symbolism had shifted. It no longer stood between them. It had become part of a shared rhythm neither had expected, but both had accepted. Still, outside the boundaries of the estate, that understanding was fragile. The world did not know the evolution that had taken place within these walls. It saw only what it wished to see, a young white billionaire married to a veiled black woman of foreign heritage, whose silence was interpreted as secrecy, and whose composure was mistaken for defiance. The press, once respectful under the shield of wealth and influence, had begun to speculate more boldly. Whispers in salons and cocktail bars turned into online headlines. The billionaire's bride, what is she hiding? Marriage of convenience or cultural cage? The woman behind the veil, a political power move? Edward saw the articles. He dismissed them publicly, even as he read each word with a growing unease. Milana, on the other hand, made no mention of the speculation. When he asked her one evening if it bothered her, she had simply said, "It is not new." But Edward was not as practiced in the art of endurance. It was at a charity gala in central London that everything shifted. The event had been planned months in advance, long before the merger or the marriage, and was now being framed as the Hastings Foundation's first major public appearance since Edward's wedding. It was a formal affair held at the Royal Orpheum, with an elite guest list, an auction to support education initiatives in underserved communities, and a guest speaker from the House of Lords. The press was invited. Cameras were expected. Appearances mattered. Edward had debated whether to bring Milana. He hated the idea of her being paraded in front of people who did not deserve her presence, but when he raised the topic with her, she looked at him and said, "This is your world. If I am to be your partner, I will walk through it." She arrived at the gala in a floor-length black gown with gold embroidery that shimmered subtly beneath the chandeliers. Her veil, sheer but still concealing, was fastened with an ornate pin at her shoulder. She stood beside Edward with a grace that neither demanded attention nor bowed under it. The flash of cameras did not make her flinch. She greeted those introduced to her with a nod and a soft-spoken greeting. She was, in every respect, a dignified enigma. The evening progressed smoothly until the keynote speech. Lord William Ashcroft, a longtime acquaintance of Edward's late father, took the stage with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. His speech began with platitudes about philanthropy and legacy, shifted into commentary on the global economic climate, and then, with a subtle smirk, veered into dangerous waters. "In times like these," he said, glancing toward Edward's table, "we must be careful not to mistake novelty for progress. Not every union forged in haste is forged in wisdom, and not every mask conceals a noble purpose." There was a pause. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, but sharp enough. Some guests exchanged glances. Others sipped champagne to avoid reaction. Edward felt the heat rise in his chest. Milana, seated beside him, did not move. Ashcroft continued, "We live in an age where optics matter more than substance, where alliances are made not out of respect but out of expediency, and where one wonders if some traditions, like seeing the face of your bride, are worth preserving after all." That did it. Edward stood. The motion was fluid, but the silence it commanded was absolute. He did not wait for permission. He crossed the room toward the stage with slow, deliberate steps, the way a storm builds before it breaks. Ashcroft paused, clearly not expecting a response. "I wasn't aware," Edward said, voice calm but edged with iron, "that the purpose of this evening was to insult my wife under the pretense of tradition." Gasps rose from the audience. Murmurs flared. Ashcroft blinked, flustered. "I merely meant to say," Edward cut him off, "that your idea of tradition is so fragile. It cannot endure the presence of a woman who chooses dignity over display, or that your definition of progress must be filtered through your comfort." The room was silent now, the cameras still as statues. "My wife," Edward said, turning to face the room, "has conducted herself with more honor, intelligence, and courage than anyone in this room tonight, including myself. If you are uncomfortable with the way she presents herself, that is a reflection of your limitations, not hers." Milana had not moved, but her hand now rested lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers curled with quiet tension. Edward's gaze swept the room. "Let this be clear. Her veil is not a wall, it is a mirror. And if you see something you dislike in it, perhaps it is your own reflection you fear." Then he turned, walked back to the table, and extended his hand to Milana. "Shall we?" She rose without a word, slipped her hand into his, and together they walked out of the gala without looking back. The fallout was immediate. The press exploded the next morning with headlines, "Hastings defends veiled wife in fiery speech." Edward Hastings confronts aristocracy in shock rebuttal. Video clips of the moment circulated widely, spawning thousands of comments, op-eds, think pieces. Some praised his defense of Milana as progressive and bold. Others accused him of virtue signaling, of hiding behind theatrics to distract from his wife's continued secrecy. Back at the estate, Edward collapsed into a chair in the study, rubbing his temples. He expected Milana to be furious, or at the very least disapproving of the spectacle. Instead, she sat across from him, serene. "You didn't have to do that," she said after a long silence. He looked up. "Yes, I did." "I've endured worse," she said. "That doesn't mean you should have to endure it again." She watched him. The fire crackled in the hearth. "I didn't know if you'd be angry," he admitted, "for making a scene." "I was surprised," she said, "but not angry." He leaned back, breathing out. "I couldn't let him speak about you that way, not when you've done nothing but carry yourself with grace and strength." Her hands folded in her lap. It mattered. He looked at her. "What did? That you saw me? That you didn't need to see my face to know who I am?" He hesitated. "I don't know everything about you, Milana. Not yet. But I know enough to know you deserve better than what this world has tried to project onto you." Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "And you're starting to understand why I wear it." He nodded. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm choosing how I am seen." He met her gaze, the only part of her face he could see clearly through the veil. "Then I'll wait until you choose to show me more." They sat in silence for a long while after that, the distance between them now filled not with uncertainty, but with something quieter, something gentler. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the last of the golden leaves scattered across the lawn. The weeks following the gala settled into a rhythm that felt markedly different from anything Edward Hastings had experienced before. There was, in the aftermath of the scandal and its whirlwind of media attention, a shift, not only in how the world perceived his marriage, but in how he and Milana now existed within it. The air between them no longer crackled with unspoken judgment or wary distance. Something had been named, stood up for, defended, and in the space that defense had carved out, something new had begun to breathe. The press, ever ravenous, circled for days. Photographers camped outside the gates, and headlines continued to speculate. Yet, Edward ignored them with an ease he had once only feigned. Milana, as ever, remained unmoved. She conducted herself with quiet elegance, navigating each day with the same calm presence that had once mystified him and now compelled him. He began to notice the finer brushstrokes of her character, the way she paused to greet the gardener each morning as she strolled through the orchard, her gentle reminders to the chef to incorporate locally grown produce, the carefully annotated notes she left for the staff detailing ways to optimize everything from inventory systems to guest protocols. She never demanded attention, and yet the house now moved in rhythm with her. It was no longer just a place he inherited. It was becoming a home. And she somehow had become its heartbeat. For Edward, the change was subtle at first. It showed in the way he lingered over breakfast longer than he once did, even when he had meetings waiting. It crept into the way he listened when Milana spoke, not just to her ideas, but to the way she delivered them, always with thoughtfulness and precision. He began asking for her input on matters beyond the company, inviting her into conversations about charitable foundations, legacy projects, education initiatives. At first, he expected hesitation, but Milana stepped into each role he offered her, not as a guest but as a rightful occupant. One afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of the estate's south gallery, Edward sat across from her at a small table reviewing plans for a new public arts initiative. He had reached a decision point about the project's location and was leaning toward a site near the financial district. Milana listened as he laid out his logic, then gently shook her head. "It's logical," she said, "but it's also forgettable. That district already has funding, exposure, and foot traffic. This initiative is about accessibility. If you place it where no one expects it, somewhere underserved perhaps, you shift perception. Not just about art, but about the people who are allowed to experience it." Edward sat back, surprised by the clarity of her argument. "You've thought about this?" "I think about everything," she replied, not with pride, but with the serene acknowledgement of someone who had been underestimated many times before. He nodded slowly. "You're right." Later that week, he presented the new location to the board, citing Milana's reasoning. It was met with initial resistance, then, gradually, with approval. When he returned home that evening, he found her in the conservatory reading. He sat beside her, not needing to speak. She closed her book, and they watched the rain together in silence. The ease between them deepened. They began to take walks together, sometimes around the gardens, other times down the estate's forest path. One evening, as twilight bathed the trees in indigo and rose, Edward found himself asking a question that had long sat unspoken. "Do you ever think about what this might have been like if we'd met differently?" Milana walked quietly beside him for a moment before answering. "I used to, when it was harder. And now?" She paused. "Now I think about what it is becoming." He looked at her then, a slow warmth filling his chest. "And what do you see?" She turned her head just slightly, her eyes catching the fading light through the veil. "Something worth tending." There were moments when Edward found himself aching to see her face, not from frustration, but from something deeper. He no longer saw the veil as a barrier. It was part of her, yes, but also part of what had shaped her. He had learned to read the nuance in her eyes, in the way she moved, in the tilt of her head when she considered something. But still, there was a longing now, not for proof of beauty, for he no longer questioned that, but for connection, unmediated and whole. One night, as they sat in the library reviewing the latest philanthropic reports, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her carefully. "I know, I said I would wait," he began, voice low, "and I meant that. But I also want you to know that I'm not waiting because I need to be convinced of anything." Milana closed the folder in her lap, hands stilling. "I see you," he said. "Maybe not in the way the world demands, but I see you, and I trust you. I trust who you are beneath it all." She didn't answer at first. Then, with the gentlest of motions, she reached across the space between them and rested her hand over his. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm almost ready." And though she didn't say more, her words stayed with him into the night. The estate prepared for its next major event, a winter gala celebrating the success of the education foundation Milana had helped expand. Edward insisted she be recognized, but Milana demurred. "It's not time," she said. "Let them see the work before they see the woman." He respected that, but he also realized how profoundly he admired her for it. When the gala evening arrived, Edward stood beneath the grand staircase greeting guests while the ballroom filled with dignitaries, artists, educators, and members of the foundation's growing network. The room glowed with candlelight and winter florals, deep reds, creams, golds. Laughter and music filled the air, but Milana was not yet present. He glanced at the clock, then again at the stairs. He told himself not to expect anything. She had not promised anything. And then the room changed. It was not loud. It was not even sudden. It was the collective intake of breath that swept through the ballroom as heads turned toward the staircase. There she stood, for the first time, without the veil. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that clung to her frame with subtle elegance, the fabric catching the light with each step. Her skin was luminous, her cheekbones high, her mouth serene. But it was her eyes. Those gray, unwavering eyes that held the room captive. She descended with a calm born not of vanity, but of choice. Edward had seen many beautiful women in his life, but never before had he seen a moment so quietly powerful, so unequivocally her own. She walked toward him and the crowd parted instinctively. When she reached him, he whispered, "Why now?" She looked at him. "Because it's time." Then, turning to the crowd, she spoke. "I know many of you have wondered why I chose to conceal my face," she began, her voice clear, smooth, and deliberate. Some assumed it was shame, or secrecy, or something to be hidden. But the truth is simpler. I wanted to be seen not for how I look, but for what I believe in, what I build, what I stand for. Silence fell across the room. Not tense, not cold, but reverent. In a world that rushes to judge what it sees, I wanted to offer a different kind of introduction. And tonight, I thank those who took the time to look deeper. Edward stepped beside her, his expression unreadable to all but her. "I see you," he said quietly. "I always have." The rest of the evening unfolded with warmth and joy. Milana moved through the ballroom with a quiet confidence that needed no explanation. Guests who had once whispered now approached with genuine curiosity and respect. Those who had doubted found themselves humbled. And Edward, standing beside her, knew with absolute certainty that this was no longer the woman his father had arranged for him to marry. This was the woman he had chosen, wholly and freely. Later that night, on the balcony overlooking the snow-dusted gardens, they stood together wrapped in silence. "You were right," he said softly. "They needed to see the work first." Milana leaned gently against him. "And now they'll see everything else." He kissed her temple, and for the first time since their union began, there was no veil between them, only the open night, the soft hush of falling snow, and the quiet certainty of what had grown between two strangers under one roof. Now something rooted, something real, something undeniable. Snow lingered on the windowsills of the Hastingbury estate like lacework, delicate and deliberate, the world outside blanketed in quiet white. Winter had settled in fully, cloaking the landscape in a silence that felt not barren but rich, like soil resting before spring. Inside, fires burned gently in hearths, warm light pooled in reading corners and over polished floors, and the house breathed in harmony with the two people now at its center. Since the gala, everything had changed, though not in the way dramatic stories often claim. There had been no sudden fanfare, no revelation that shifted the axis of their world. Rather, the change had been subtle, deeply felt, and quietly monumental. The veil, once a symbol of distance and mystery, was gone, and with its removal came a new rhythm between Edward and Milana, one rooted in clarity, in trust, and in the mutual decision to move forward without the need for pretense. Their mornings now began in tandem. Coffee was brewed not by the staff but by Edward himself, a habit he insisted on. They would sit in the sunlit breakfast nook and talk, sometimes about the day ahead, sometimes about nothing at all. These small rituals, once foreign, had become precious. Edward found himself looking forward to the warmth of her presence, to the sound of her voice breaking the morning stillness. Milana, too, had transformed. Not in essence, for her essence had always been the same, but in how freely she now let it shine. She smiled more easily. She laughed sometimes. Her posture, always composed, now carried something more, something open, grounded, unburdened. The woman who had once walked through corridors like a shadow now stood fully in the light, not because she had changed, but because he finally saw her for what she was. Professionally, their bond deepened with similar grace. Edward, once guarded over the workings of his empire, now involved Milana in decisions large and small, not as a courtesy, but as necessity. Her insight had proven not only useful, but invaluable. She had a way of seeing through noise, of finding the heart of a matter when others became lost in ego or numbers. Where Edward brought vision and decisiveness, Milana brought clarity and balance. They had become, in every way, partners. One afternoon, as a biting wind blew outside and the house hummed with the quiet activity of winter preparation, Edward entered the main study holding a file. Milana sat near the fire, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. He dropped into the chair opposite her and handed over the file. "Whitman merger," he said. "Their board wants to revisit the profit-sharing model again." She raised an eyebrow as she skimmed the pages. "They're still dancing around the sustainability clause. I think they're trying to buy time. Or leverage." Milana nodded. "Then it's time to change the framing. Focus less on percentages, more on shared longevity. They need to see this as a partnership, not a feeding ground." Edward leaned back, watching her with a smile. "You know," he said after a pause, "if I didn't have you, I'd probably still be sending angry emails and losing the deal entirely." "You would have gotten there," she replied. "Not like this." They met with the Whitman board later that week. Milana joined the meeting for the first time, not as Edward's guest, but as his strategic advisor. There were raised eyebrows, certainly, some from those still unaccustomed to her presence, others from those not ready to reconcile her authority with their assumptions. But Milana, calm and unshaken, addressed each point with confidence. Her analysis was sharp, her delivery poised. When she spoke, the room listened. Afterward, as they walked down the corridor toward the elevator, Edward turned to her. "You were incredible." "I was honest," she said. "Sometimes that's enough." That night, they dined together in the conservatory, the moonlight catching on the frost-laced glass above. Edward watched her across the table, the candlelight painting her features in soft gold. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, folding his napkin in his lap. She glanced up, curious. "Why did you agree to marry me?" The question hung in the air, not heavy, but meaningful. Milana set her fork down gently. "Because I saw potential," she answered after a moment. "In the alliance, yes, but also in you." He tilted his head slightly. "Even back then? Especially back then." "And have I lived up to it?" he asked quietly. Her eyes met his, steady and warm. "You're getting there." In the weeks that followed, the estate buzzed with preparations for a new series of initiatives Milana had begun championing. A mentorship program for young women in business, a scholarship fund for students from underserved communities, a series of educational forums on ethical capitalism. Where Edward had once viewed philanthropy as a duty, Milana turned it into purpose. And Edward, to his surprise, discovered that purpose suited him. They traveled together now, New York, Zurich, Nairobi, meeting partners, visiting projects, sharing stages. Where he was sharp, she was grounding. Where she challenged, he adapted. They disagreed often, but not with venom. Their conflicts sharpened them, clarified priorities. More than once, Edward found himself reconsidering deeply held assumptions simply because she had posed the right question at the right moment. At home, their life was quieter but no less rich. Edward began collecting old books again, a childhood hobby long abandoned. Milana had a growing collection of rare teas and spent afternoons in the library reading. They cooked together sometimes, or walked the grounds, or played chess in the evening by the fire. It was not perfect, no life is, but it was honest, and it was shared. One winter evening, as snow fell thick and slow beyond the tall windows, Edward stood by the fireplace reading over a new project proposal. Milana entered, holding 2 mugs of spiced cider. "I was thinking," she said as she handed him one, "we should bring in community voices earlier for the artisan market idea, not just advisory, but collaborative." He took the mug, smiling. "You're thinking 5 steps ahead of me again." "That's why you married me?" she said, arching a brow. "Is that why?" She looked at him, amused. "Partly." He set the proposal aside and took her hand. "And you, why did you really marry me?" She stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. "Because I thought maybe you'd learn how to see." "And did I?" She looked up, eyes soft. "Yes, you see clearly now." Their conversation drifted into silence, and they stood together for a while, watching the fire. Edward thought back to the man he had been, angry, suspicious, resistant. He remembered the weight of expectation, the suffocating sense of obligation. And he looked now at the woman who had quietly, patiently dismantled those walls, not by forcing her way in, but by standing firm and letting him choose to lower them. Later that week, Edward called a meeting with the entire senior team at Hastings Group. The boardroom was full, the energy anticipatory. When the formal updates concluded, he stood at the head of the table and turned to Milana. "Before we adjourn," he said, "I want to formally acknowledge someone who has become more than an advisor, more than a partner behind the scenes. Her insight has shaped nearly every major decision we've made in the last 6 months. Her vision, her clarity, her unwavering standards have made us not just stronger, but better." He extended a hand toward her. "Milana Hastings is no longer simply my wife. As of today, she will be joining our executive board." There was a beat of silence, then applause, genuine, sustained, and full. Milana stood, nodded once, then addressed the room. "I'm honored," she said, "not because of the title, but because of what we can build together. My role here is not just to advise, but to challenge, to question, to protect what matters most, our values. Let's make that our legacy." After the meeting, as they walked through the building hand in hand, Edward turned to her. "I never imagined this is where we'd end up." "Neither did I," she replied. "But I think we've done well." He smiled. "Better than I could have hoped." That evening, back at the estate, they stood on the balcony beneath a canopy of stars. The city sparkled in the distance and the quiet stretched between them, not empty but full. Edward wrapped an arm around her and held her close. "No matter what comes next," he said, "I'm ready, as long as it's with you." Milana looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the night sky. "Together," she said, and there, in the stillness of a winter night, in the heart of a home that had once felt like a prison, 2 people stood side by side, no longer strangers bound by obligation, but partners bound by choice, respect, and a love that had grown, not from what they had seen, but from what they had chosen to understand. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories like this one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.